A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again, yet again. So, let's do something different here. I have talked a bit about Universal films before, but I feel like now would at least be a good time to get a little bit more into them. More specifically, we could talk a bit about a film series that went on for a pretty long time. And by all means, maybe not the whole entirety of the series as it stands today here in 2024 going on 2025, but maybe let's go ahead and cover the almighty Michael Crichton adaptation, Jurassic Park. Yeah. Some people have in fact been wanting me to talk a bit more about the Jurassic Park franchise, especially since I had already touched up on it at a few different points in time. One of the more recent ends was in films I should have talked about years ago, season 1, 3.5 years ago, where I did talk a bit about Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, but I will admit, it probably wasn't my best job at it. I hadn't watched the film all too much, but I have since done so, renting it a couple different times in order to have full understanding of the film's context. And I've even seen Jurassic World, as well as Jurassic World Dominion, in theaters. So of course, there's probably no excuse for me to ignore this series for so long, much less on the fact that I had talked a bit about it a few different times, and some people have been wanting me to talk about it again. This is really a point where requests for me to talk about film franchises for the first time in a long time have actually been hammered. In this case, a lot of people really throttled it. So you know what? Let's give you guys exactly what you want. So be sure to indulge as I revisit the Jurassic Park trilogy and the Jurassic World trilogy. But much like when I covered the Air Bud series, I did say I would follow up in Air Buddies, but at a different point in time. So let's do the same here. We'll stick with the first 3 Jurassic Park films, and as for the entirety of the rest, we'll leave it out for some point in the future. So anyways, Jurassic Park, Steven Spielberg, Michael Crichton, a 1990 novel turned into a 1993 hit movie released in June of 1993, and most importantly, having probably one of the best assembled casts in history. Apart from Ghostbusters or Jaws or many other film series that have gone on, even Home Alone and The Godfather have all proven to have some of the greatest castings ever made. But Jurassic Park was sure to be one of the best that I've remembered. Even back then, it was hard to imagine a film that could comprise the likes of Sam Neill, Jeff Goldblum, Wayne Knight, Richard Attenborough, and many, many, many other people all into one movie. A movie that had run for 127 minutes from beginning to end and had grossed over $1 billion. Similarly, other movies that grossed that much would include The Lion King and Titanic. But that's just scratching the surface of how successful the 90s were by movie standards. Anyways though, Jurassic Park. This is the legendary story that Michael Crichton originally told back in 1990. And apart from him actually being the major screenplayer for this film, apart from Steven Spielberg being the prime director, and apart from having a big cast, we got a masterpiece in hand, with 2 sequels that would follow within less than a decade after its release. The first film, of course, centers on Isla Nublar, a location that is set 120 miles west of Costa Rica. This island is in fact home to an ongoing prehistoric revelation in life. Because as it stands, a bioengineering company known as InGen is in fact crafting something unlike anything that had ever been done in history. This bioengineering project in question concerns the likes of prehistoric life. And with over 30 years worth of time that had passed since we had first seen this series spring to life, this was ubiquitously the main reason why the early 90s were so memorable, and also why dinosaurs were made as one of the main crazes of the decade itself. Apart from gross out humor, slapstick comedy, and even with the likes of famous actors like Macaulay Culkin and Bruce Willis, Jurassic Park was in fact the culmination of all these different dinosaur media that had spawned throughout the early 90s, and was essentially the greatest way to put it all together in a film. Period. Jurassic Park, of course, gives us some insight as to what could happen. But we are then cut to a certain scene where a paleontologist, Dr. Alan Grant, played by Sam Neill, as well as his partner, Dr. Ellie Sattler, they both get together on account of a little message. And after meeting up with the man known as Richard Attenborough's own John Hammond, well, they all agree to come along with him on a special trip by helicopter, alongside other members that would come along. The group would make their way to Isla Nublar, and Hammond presents to them Jurassic Park. The first sight that they see while out on a little jeep ride in the open landscape is a monstrous Brachiosaurus. Yep. The Brachiosaurus is in fact a sight to behold, and even more so when you get to know about the effects that they used, which of course weren't exactly CGI. Even though it might seem to be that way, for the 90s, it was a bit tough to put it together, even back then. Some other films, of course, were able to accomplish the usage of CG, like Terminator 2 and even Mortal Kombat 95. But ultimately, we know what CGI contender of the 90s truly did execute CG in a great fashion. Toy Story. But that didn't happen until later, obviously. In any case, though, the effects brought on by this Brachiosaurus that is reared up on its hind legs just to get some food from a tree was not just any sight to be seen by the likes of Dr. Grant, Sattler, Malcolm, and Hammond himself. But this was in fact Hammond's way to reveal, not only to us audience members, but to the rest of the gang involved, this is Jurassic Park. It only gets better though as the film goes on, because we're eventually introduced to Mr. Hammond's grandchildren, Tim and Lex. And being child actors, it was a bit hard to imagine them being any more successful than that of Macaulay Culkin's own Kevin McAllister, but by all means, they did a pretty good job on their part too. And the thing is that child acting, while it is seen as a bit of a nightmare, even by today's standards, Tim and Lex's actors still did a fantastic job for what they did. And wouldn't you know that by this point in time, it's important to know that with the likes of Tim and Lex Murphy, whom are still played by Joseph Mazzello and Ariana Richards, they have actually since managed to make good careers since their success in Jurassic Park. And it's not just for them being grandchildren, but as the film goes on, there's that scene with some Chilean sea bass, and eventually there comes a point where a tour is scheduled for the group. You have the grandkids, you have Grant, you have Sattler, you have Malcolm, and they're all going into a special duo of 1991 Ford Explorers. They're all painted and modified for usage as tour vehicles built along a track specifically designed to carry them all throughout the land itself that Jurassic Park has to offer. Many exhibits, of course, include Dilophosaurus, Triceratops, and T-Rex. However, things don't go so well. The first ever tour of Jurassic Park is supposed to be made with some amazing pieces. Of course, as we've also come to know, there was that part where velociraptors were introduced. At first by hatching, and then by feeding fully grown raptors in their own paddock. So of course, the tour is really where things start to go rough, Because after those 2 no-shows and that sick Triceratops that was made, well, there are some in and out moments where we cut back and forth, not just with the tour vehicle and the half of the crew that are there, but some other cast members, including Mr. Arnold, played by Samuel L. Jackson, as well as Hammond himself, as well as another employee of the park known as Dennis Nedry. It's important to note that Nedry, we first saw him in a Hawaiian shirt with a can of Barbasol shaving cream. Of course, Barbasol wasn't necessarily meant as a promotional thing. However, it becomes an important factor in the film's plot later on, and even more so when you get to know about the company Telltale Games. But that's a story for another day. In any case though, Nedry does let Hammond know about how things are rolling along the road, and basically goes so far to claim that he's going to have to debug the system. If you're not familiar with debugging or computers, Jurassic Park was definitely one of those that allowed for us tech geeks and nerds to truly understand about how computer systems worked, and also how did hacking go down in order to bring down an entire system worth of security cameras, grids, locks, and everything. They all went offline in a matter of seconds. But you know what? The main thing that goes on is that a tropical storm ends up oversweeping Isla Nublar, and the tour vehicles, of course, that had Tim and Lex, as well as their lawyer, as well as Dr. Grant, as well as Malcolm, as Ellie would basically stay behind to help the Triceratops. But in any case though, they all come up to the Tyrannosaurus Rex paddock in the dark and in the pouring rain, stranded for the time being. Of course, there is a goat inside the paddock, and that's supposedly going to act as food for the T-Rex. Yet, the real trouble starts right around now. Nedry initiates a debugging program that supposedly will cause some security systems to go on or off at certain points while he goes on a supposed 18 to 20 minute long thing to the vending machine to grab some salty snacks, as he's had a lot of sweets. But of course, it's all just a diversion, because this debugging program that he initiates actually brings the systems offline, like for good. So the thing is, he essentially hacked the system and was able to initiate a full shutdown of the security system. It not only caused the cameras to stop, it not only caused the locks to unlock, but it also shut down all security protection grids for all of the dinosaur paddocks. Nothing was electrified, nothing was locked down, and nothing was engaged. And you know what that means? It's time for the park to go to hell. Quite literally, in fact. Because Nedry, of course, does make his way over to a cryogenic chamber in which dinosaur embryos are located. And you remember that Barbasol can? Well, it apparently holds a little secret inside. It's not an actual can of shaving cream, despite what it looks like on the outside. No, it's actually a vessel that was specifically designed for Nedry to carry, because he was contracted, after all, by some corporate members to carry an entire shaving cream can full of embryos off the island. And they supposedly would pay him a lot of money for it. Yeah, it's one of those little conspiracies that goes down because corporate greed and satisfaction really go to show how something quite ambitious and ginormous could turn into a big Tyrannosaurus wreck. So of course, Nedry does manage to escape the place with the embryos in possession, and he steals one of those Jeeps that are also Jurassic Park designed quite well, much like the Explorers were. But this 92 Jeep Wrangler, unlike the 91 Ford Explorers, could definitely take a beating because they were certainly made to go off-road. However, Nedry does come across some little blockades along the way. He has to open some doors and find his way through the jungle just to carve a path over to a certain boat that's waiting for him out in the storm. And like I've said, if you're familiar with Telltale Games, they'll actually cue you in much more further on such details, including Nedry's fate, as well as the boat in question. And not to mention, many people whom were involved in Nedry's attempt to smuggle embryos off the island. Of course, Nedry, however, doesn't get so lucky, but we'll come back to him in a bit, because the real trouble obviously does go on in the Tyrannosaur paddock. Just when you thought that the goat wasn't going to be eaten, it apparently is missing. A bone falls on top of the car, and next thing you know, the T-Rex manages to break free from its own paddock. This Rex, dubbed Rexy, in fact, is a force to be reckoned with, and is certainly one of Stan Winston's most impressively made animatronics to be created for film ever. The entire scene alone is just pandemonium when you least expect it. It's quite suspenseful at first and really gets you in a pretty nervous state. Is that Rex going to eat those guys alive? Well, it doesn't seem like it at first. After all, Tim and Lex get abandoned by their lawyer as he runs all the way to the restroom, and Grant and Malcolm can just watch what's going on. Of course, Tim does grab a nearby flashlight, but the light does attract the T-Rex right to them. And after some time passes, they're screwed. The Rex just flips the car over and crushes it, causing them to be submerged in mud, and the fact that they're this close to being crushed underfoot really is something very wrong. Grant, of course, just cannot stand and watch it, this whole thing happen. So he goes to the back of the car that they're in with him and Malcolm, and he grabs some flares in which he is able to use to divert the T-Rex's attention, since supposedly the T-Rex has bad eyesight and can't see anything unless it's moving. We know that that's not true, though. In fact, there's a lot of things about Jurassic Park that I could go well into detail on because of some inaccuracies. But if you really want to check out the inaccuracies and the many things about the dinosaurs that are wrong, I highly recommend Tele-Animated's evolution video on the Jurassic Park dinosaurs, which I'll leave a link to in the description box below. Of course, the T-Rex does cause one of the cars, plus Tim, whom is still trapped inside, to fall off into a tree as Grant and Lex barely make it out of there. The T-Rex, of course, does wander off, and while the rest of them are able to make it to safety, well, Malcolm supposedly gets buried underneath the wrecked restroom. The lawyer gets eaten alive on screen, which really is something that intrigued a lot of people back then. But even today, it's amazing to watch. Of course, Tim and Lex do manage to rappel down the side of the wall and eventually make their way to Tim, barely saving him from the car as it continues to fall through the tree all the way to the ground. And well, it's just the trio who was out and about on foot to try and find their way back to the visitor center. As for Malcolm, he does get injured, unfortunately, because of the restroom collapsing on top of him. He eventually is discovered by the likes of Dr. Sattler as well as Robert Muldoon, whom find him and are able to put him inside their Jeep. As for T-Rex, well, he eventually does come back, and supposedly this is what Watch Mojo describes as the best dinosaur film scene ever, called Must Go Faster. After all, Malcolm himself does utter those words, must go faster. Just like that. It's an impressive chase scene where the T-Rex is in fact moving at least 30 miles per hour. Hammond did claim it could go 32 miles per hour, and that Jeep didn't seem like it was going any faster. But of course, Robert is able to get them out of there. And just when they thought they were out of the clutches of trouble, they unfortunately weren't, though. Because in addition to the T-Rex breaking out of the paddock, the Dilophosaurus attacking Nedry, because after all, Nedry does find himself in a bit of trouble after the Jeep gets caught on a tree, and he tries to use the winch to free it, but the Dilophosaurus ends up killing him by spitting in his face with its venom, which was another trait that was inaccurate about the Dilo. Also its size. Like I said though, check the video down below if you want to know about what Dilophosaurus was truly like, as well as all the other dinosaurs. But of course, after all that goes down, we do in fact get to some points in the film where Mr. Arnold does clarify that after all the crap that had been put together on Nedry's computer, the supposed hack that went down that caused the security system to fail, and of course, with all the dinosaurs now being freed, they had to find a way to re-secure the building and surrounding areas. So you know what they had to do? They had to rewrite 2 million lines of code that were put together in the software itself. And once they do, they reboot the system. But it does seem like there's another little problem going on. Yeah, a substation basically houses separate controls to allow various systems to come back on. Many security systems, many electrical fences, they all had to be manually reset. Of course, Sattler makes her way over there. And as for Robert Muldoon, he carries a Spaz 12 shotgun with him in order to, in fact, defend himself from any trouble, but also to try and cover Sattler as she, in fact, makes her way to the substation. Sattler is guided by Hammond by radio, as the phones were also offline when Nedry shut down the system. Yeah, this was apparently before cell phones were common, even though they technically were around. Makes you think. Anyways, though, Sattler is able to successfully get everything back online. Of course, this doesn't mean everything's okay, because even though Hammond had successfully guided her into priming the handle to power up the system and then have everything closed, which of course does lead us to a point where, yeah, if you remember Grant and the kids, well, they not only managed to get out of the way of the T-Rex and the falling car from the tree, they do encounter a pack of Gallimimuses and eventually are led to one of the electrified fences, which Grant does trick them into thinking that he's getting electrocuted, which seemed a little funny at first, but was pretty scary, actually. Imagine if the fences did come back on. Well, not to speak too soon, of course. That's actually what does happen. They end up climbing over the fence, hearing the alarms go off that the systems are about to come back online, as that's what Sattler was doing. Once she gets to the fences, zap, goes poor Tim. He's sent into cardiac arrest as 10,000 volts of electricity, which certainly would have been able to kill a person. But thankfully, Tim was resuscitated with some CPR. And if that's not crazy enough, well, Sattler does make her way out of the substation after being encountered by some raptors, ends up finding the dismembered arm of Mr. Arnold, since he went in there as well at one point, but failed to do what was what. He had gotten killed by the raptors, and even though Sattler made it out of there alive, Muldoon doesn't quite make it out of there alive either. His hunt for the raptors gets intercepted by another famous moment. A clever girl sidelines him. The shotgun is unable to do anything. The stock was fully extended, so obviously mobility wasn't quite in Muldoon's favor, as we do get to see yet another character get mauled to death by a dinosaur. Of course, while Sattler makes it out alive, Grant and the kids eventually do make their way to the visitor center, and Ellie comes along as well. So it's basically just the four of them all together. And well, when they're all together in the visitor center, you know what happens? Well, first off, we are at least put together into a certain meal that Tim and Lex have, but then they notice the raptors from behind the glass wall. Basically, this wall encompasses a mural of the dinosaurs themselves. These murals are a pretty popular piece of the visitor center, apart from Mr. DNA and the fine cuisine they have to serve in Isla Nublar, including some Jello. Yeah. Tim and Lex retreat to the kitchen, where they're then stalked by the raptors. For a few minutes worth of screen time, it's easy to see why this is yet another amazing moment in the film. The raptors just stalk the two kids relentlessly, and a few times they seem to have been spotted. Lex gets seen climbing into a nearby cupboard, but is able to get out as the reflection was cast on the wall nearby, allowing a raptor to bash its head in. Lex gets out of there, but Tim also tries to make a run for it, this time going to the freezer, where the other raptor is following him close behind. And it's certainly worth knowing that apart from the unique animatronics that they made for the film, there was also costumes involved. Yeah, for the raptors, they actually had stunt performers dressing up as the raptors themselves. Another unique mark of Stan Winston's creativity. So that's another unique effect that they put together. Animatronics and costumes. So you couldn't go wrong with that back in the day. And nowadays, you could probably make everything possible with little practical effects. All the wonders of technology. In any case though, raptors are thankfully subdued. One gets locked up in the freezer, and the other one does see them walking out of the kitchen. As the kids make their way back to Grant and Sadler, they are yet again intercepted by more raptors, because after all, let's not forget, there were 3 raptors in total, 2 of which had escaped, and the third one supposedly was contained. But after all, a raptor somehow is able to go from learning about eating cows to opening doors. And so, lots of different moments about the raptors themselves were quite amazing to see. The fact they can open doors, stalk children, and chomp down on cows shows that they are as intelligent as possible. Even taking down a guy with a shotgun, that's really something worthwhile of predatory instinct from millions of years ago. Even Grant himself did say earlier in the film that you can't suppress 65 million years of gut instinct. Of course, the 4 are eventually surrounded by the raptors. The T-Rex, however, is still on the loose and gobbles the raptors up. He takes them down and buys them time to escape. And well, when the 4 of them do get out of the visitor center, they're greeted by a Jeep with Hammond and Malcolm inside, since after all, what had happened was that we got to see Lex and Tim operating on one of the computers, in which they were able to boot up the door locks and even get the power to the phones working, so that way they could contact Hammond, and Hammond could contact the mainland for them to send a helicopter their way. So talk about some tuition, not just by Dr. Sattler, but by the kids. It goes to show that when you put your minds to it, you could accomplish anything. And by coming together, in spite of some disagreements that happened earlier in the film, they did learn to work together to accomplish what seemed to be impossible. When you're cornered by raptors, that's just the thing about instinct. You must find a way to survive and get out of there before it's too late. Which they do. And by the end of the film, everybody boards the helicopter, and we get ourselves a bit of a glance at the piece of amber on Hammond's staff, which houses a mosquito inside. Because after all, earlier in the film, at around the same time that Dr. Henry Wu was monitoring some raptor hatchlings, we got to see a little animated piece with Mr. DNA talking a bit about how mosquitoes with dino DNA were preserved in amber for millions of years. Amber was essentially the hardened form of old tree sap that had in fact encased the mosquitoes inside, preserving DNA for millions of years. And after all that's happened with frog DNA to fill in the gaps, with dinosaurs hatching out of eggs, practically reborn for the first time in millions of years, to all the crap that went down that night when Nedry shut everything down, all in the matter of trying to profit from embryos. But like I've said though, there could be a time where I might get to talk about video games maybe another section of the Talk About universe dedicated to video games entirely. And Telltale's Jurassic Park is a great way to find out more about these embryos. But more importantly, what happened after Nedry was killed by that Dilo? Well, that is a story for an entirely different video. But all in all, that helicopter flies away with the remaining survivors, while anyone else that's still on the island kind of has to fend for themselves. So, the first Jurassic Park film. It was undoubtedly a masterpiece. It pioneered a lot of amazing techniques in effects, practical and visual, as well as the usage of many different angulations and the unique, visceral experience of fighting for survival. While it's not exactly a new thing, I mean, there were plenty of other pieces that came along before it. Terminator, Escape from New York, and there of course were even the RoboCop films, which did show that fighting for survival was a major instinct and a big plot point to help move the story along and eventually lead to an ultimate climax. You know, that T-Rex sure proved dinosaurs still ruled the earth even after all this time. But just on this one island in particular. There are many other things about the franchise, though, that I could go into detail of, including the novel, including many things. But like I've said, all of that is going to have to come at a different point in time. So, my overall scoring for Jurassic Park is going to be set at a 9.5 out of 10.1. And I feel like that at this point, with 2 sequels on the line, it'll eventually come down to an epic piece worth showing. A trilogy that is certainly more than worth talking about by this point. And I'm glad that some of you guys have been able to at least suggest that I get to that series. With all that covered, 2 more films to go. And I certainly will have a lot more to say about the series entirely. As for Jurassic World, we'll hold on to that for a little while until some other point in time, much like Air Buddies or a lot of other things. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.
I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.